Hi everyone, I'm here with Sarah Gailey, author of Upright Women Wanted, and I will turn it over.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you so much for having me, Willard. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so honored to have the opportunity to talk about Upright Women Wanted. This book is a novella, which for those who aren't familiar is a very short book. It's shorter than a novel. This would take probably 2 to 3 hours to read. Upright Women Wanted is a pulp western that takes place in the near future American Southwest, in a future where, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later after I read you a little bit, but where basically the existing military imperialist ideals that America has been espousing for the last several years have gone to their natural conclusion. And as a result, people need to live in a way that people lived in the days of the Old West. It follows a character named Esther as she learns more about the librarians, who are an order of morally upright women who are celibate and don't keep the company of men, and who only live to further the state's ideals and distribute state-approved reading materials and media, aka propaganda. As Esther learns more about the librarians and about herself, she discovers that they aren't everything they seem. So I'm going to start us out with a reading from chapters 1 and 2, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the background that went into this book and kind of what I'm trying to say with it before we have a little chat with each other. I'm going to drink some water first so that I don't end up sounding like a tree frog while I'm doing this reading, which is a very definite possibility and has happened in the past. Okay, chapter 1. As Esther breathed in the sweet, musty smell of the horse blankets in the back of the librarian's wagon, she chewed on the I told you so feeling that had overwhelmed her ever since her father had told her the news about Beatriz. She'd known that none of it would come to any good. She told Beatriz as much. Tried to tell her anyway, but Beatriz never did listen. She always was stubborn as a hot day, the kind that comes too long before a storm breaks, and so she hanged. She swung by her neck while Esther's father, Victor Augustus, made a speech about the dangers of deviance. Silas Whitmore had stood a few feet behind the podium with his fists clenched in his pockets. His lips had been pressed together tight, his eyes on Esther. Not on Beatriz. He wouldn't hardly look at Beatriz at all. His eyes were on Esther, who had lied to her father and told him she'd make the whole thing right. The head librarian didn't find Esther Augustus until they were 2 whole days outside of Valor, Arizona. She swore so loud and colorful that it snapped Esther right out of the Beatriz dream she'd been having. And by the time Esther was sitting upright, the head librarian's revolver was pointed right at her face. "Don't shoot me," Esther said, her voice raspy. Her mouth tasted foul from 2 days with only the bottle of water she'd brought, 2 days without a toothbrush and without food. "Please," she added, because her mother had raised her right, and because manners seemed like a good idea when a gun was involved. "Give me a single good reason." The head librarian's badge glittered in the early morning sun. It was a hammered copper star with 3 columns etched into it, one for virtue, one for knowledge, and one for patriotism. It shone as bright as Beatriz's eyes had. Esther wasn't sure if the head librarian was asking for a single good reason to shoot or a single good reason not to, but she decided to play her only card. "My name is Esther Augustus," she said. "My father is Victor Augustus. He's the superintendent of the lower Southwest Territory," she added uncertainly. The head librarian surely knew who Victor Augustus was, but her face didn't change at the sound of his name. Her square jaw was set just the same as it had been. Her flinty gray eyes were just as furious, and her finger was still awfully close to the trigger of her 6-shooter. "Lita?" The head librarian didn't yell, but her voice carried all the same. After a few seconds, Esther heard unhurried footsteps crunching toward the wagon. The head librarian didn't take her eyes off Esther as those footsteps approached, her gaze matching the unblinking eye that was the barrel of her gun. All 3 of those eyes watched Esther Augustus, and she watched them back, too dehydrated to sweat and unable to draw a full breath. "Damn it, Bet, if you can't start dealing with scorpions on your own, I'll—" "Oh!" A second woman appeared next to the head librarian. Bet, Lita had called her. The 2 women couldn't have looked more different. Lita was tall and wide, where Bet was somewhere between wiry and scrawny. She was pale, where Bet was brown. Her skin smooth, where Bet was scarred. Lita's eyes were gentle. At least, they were, until they landed on Esther's little nest among the saddle blankets and dry goods. When she saw Esther's hiding place, those gentle eyes flashed hard, then went wary and darting. Now, Lita, Bet growled, her eyes still on Esther like a snake watching an approaching ankle. Didn't I ask you to check this wagon when we left town? Lita didn't answer, but her face told the story well enough. Asked to do the task, didn't feel like doing it, said it was done to move things along. Please don't shoot me, Esther said, coughing as the words hit her dry throat. I didn't mean any harm. It's just that you're running away, Bet intoned flatly. You're running away to join the librarians. Well, I'm not running away from anything, Esther stammered, the lie loose on her tongue. I'm running to something. Give the girl some water, Lita muttered to Bet. She's delirious. She's Victor Augustus's daughter, Bet replied. Lita's eyes got big as she looked back to Esther. Those eyes were canaries, Esther realized. They sang everything that passed through Lita's head loud and clear enough for anyone to catch. Shit, she hissed. We don't have time for this. Does your father know where you are right now? Bet asked. Esther hesitated, then shook her head. Bet mirrored the movement. No? Stupid to tell me so, she said. If he doesn't know you're here, there's not a chance of a consequence for me if I shoot you dead and dump your body in the desert. She sighed, lowering the revolver, and Esther took in a full breath at long last. Get out of that wagon before you sweat fierce stink all over my horse blankets. Lita, this water is coming out of your supply. With that, Bet walked away and out of sight. Esther slid out of the wagon on weak legs, her feet slipping in the gravel. She'd worn her most practical shoes, but she could already tell they wouldn't keep her upright on the trails the librarians rode. Not that good shoes should be her immediate concern, she thought. She couldn't rightly say that this wasn't going according to plan, since there hadn't been much of a plan in the first place, but it certainly wasn't going the way she'd hoped. She couldn't think of why a head librarian would need to carry a revolver instead of a rifle. A rifle would do just fine for whatever might be in the desert, whatever might come across the horizon to make a woman nervous. A revolver was too close up for a woman to carry, her father had always said. A revolver was a man's weapon made to end an argument. A librarian, Esther thought, shouldn't ever have need of arguing. That was the whole point. A strong, calloused hand caught her by the elbow before she could stumble again. It was Lita holding a canteen. Esther would have sworn she could smell the water inside it. She drank too gratefully, and that strong hand slapped her on the back hard enough to make her cough up the water she'd inhaled. You don't want to lie to Bet. You understand? Lita whispered, her mouth close enough to Esther's ear to stir the hair near her temples. I wouldn't, Esther replied. She decided not to remember the last time Beatrice had been that close to her ear. The things they'd whispered to each other then. I mean it, Lita said. She'll know if you lie, and if you do, you can forget about her letting you stay. Esther nodded, her heart pounding. If she played this thing wrong, she had no idea what might happen. Maybe Bet would take her home to face her father's wrath. Maybe Bet would turn her loose in the scrubland to wander lost and alone. Maybe Bet would pull that iron out again, and maybe this time she'd use it. But Esther reminded herself that was only if she screwed up. If she did everything right, she might just get to become a librarian. A full canteen of water later, Esther was sitting on a rock across from Lita and Bet, and she was lying harder than she ever had before. I've always wanted to be a librarian, she said, looking Bet right in the face, making her eyes wide and earnest the way she did whenever she talked to the superintendent about the importance of the flag and the troops and the border. Her long hair was matted with sweat in spite of the tight braid she'd bound it in before climbing into the back of the wagon, and she felt like something that had gotten stuck on the tread of a tank. But none of that would matter if she could just make herself shine with earnest dedication to the cause. Ever since I was a little girl, I dreamed of joining an honorable brigade of morally upright women doing rewarding work, supporting a bright future for the nation's children. Bet finished flatly. You memorized those posters. I hate those things, Lita muttered, and Bet shot her a sharp look. Of course I memorized them, Esther said. If she didn't blink for long enough, she could get her eyes to water a little, so she looked like she was overcome with passion for the librarian's work. She clasped her hands together in front of her and let her shoulders rise. I had one of the recruitment posters hung over my bed since I was a little girl. I love everything about librarians. What's the part that appeals most? Bet asked. I just admire the work you do so much, she gasped, and there it was. Her eyes were burning, and she knew they'd take on a real shine soon. Helping to further the spread of correct education is so important. If it weren't for the librarians, no one would have up-to-date approved materials to read and watch and listen to. My father always said... Bet made a soft sound, and Esther reminded herself not to bring up her father again for a little while. He always said that when boredom takes hold, that's when people get up to trouble. So I figure that if it weren't for the librarians, people would probably be coming up with dangerous new materials all the time. She looked down at her feet and gave a soft sniff. I just want to help. I want to be part of something that's bigger than I am. I want to be a librarian. Esther flushed a little with pride. Surely that little speech had done the job. When she looked back up, Bet didn't seem impressed. That was a fine performance, she said, running her finger across the thick, cruel scar that cut through her left eyebrow. I don't doubt you put a hell of a lot of effort into it. Would you like to try a different tactic, though? Telling the truth, maybe? Esther glanced at Lita, who gave her an I-told-you-so smile. Her heart pounded hard and fast and high in her chest. That had been her best angle. The speech she'd been practicing for those 2 overheated days under a pile of saddle blankets. She stared at Bet, aware that the longer she waited, the more it would be obvious that she was trying to come up with a lie. She closed her eyes and gave her head a little shake. All right, she said. The truth is, my father was going to try to marry me off. To a man I don't love him. I don't even know him, and I couldn't stand it. The idea of becoming his wife after... She stopped short because she couldn't talk about what had happened, not without giving everything away. And she couldn't tell the librarians all of it. If she did, they'd never let her become one of them. They were some of the most dedicated civil servants on the state payroll. They'd report her for sure. Bet's eyes flashed. After what? Esther swallowed painfully. Careful now. My best friend, she said. She was engaged to him before, but she was executed for possession of unapproved materials. Some kind of pamphlet about Utah. I don't know, she added hastily, and it was true. She hadn't known. Beatrice hadn't seen fit to share the unapproved materials with her. Hadn't trusted her enough, maybe, or wanted to protect her. No reason could make it less bitter, though, knowing that Beatrice had kept such a huge secret. I didn't know she had him, or I would have tried to stop her. I would have tried to make it right. I think she was going to tell me the night before she was caught. She said she wanted to tell me something, but... Esther trailed off because nothing good could come of her talking too much about Beatrice. She returned to the better part of that detail, the part she thought would make them like her more. I never knew she had unapproved materials. I swear it. I would have done something if I'd known. Lita coughed into her fist. Again, Bet shot her a look. You all right over there? Bet asked. Just fine, Lita said. Dusty out here is all. So your friend died, Bet said. Happens to the best of us. You ought to pick your friends better, maybe. Rage flared suddenly in Esther's chest and throat, pounded hot in her temples. There's no such thing as a better friend than Beatrice, and you have no damn idea what you're... She stopped herself. That wasn't the right way to do this. You're right, she said, straining to sound calm. I suppose I should have seen it sooner. I should have been more careful. Bet leaned her elbows on her knees, stared intently at Esther. That outburst had caught her attention, it seemed. Damn. So she hanged, Bet said, her voice suddenly soft. And you ran off. Esther nodded. It was close enough to true. Bet continued, speaking low and gentle, and as she did, Esther found herself leaning forward too. You couldn't stay there anymore, is that right? You didn't want to marry that boy? And you didn't want to stay there if Beatrice wasn't going to be there? Her words drew something up out of a deep, locked-up place in Esther's belly, something unplanned and uncareful. It's not just that I didn't want to stay there, she said. I couldn't stay there. It was too dangerous for everyone. Why was it dangerous? Bet whispered, her gaze intent. Over her shoulder, Lita had gone very still, but everything that wasn't Bet's eyes seemed far off as the horizon. Because Beatrice died, and they were going to marry me to someone important, Esther said. I would have had so much power to spread my poison to so many people, so I thought that if I joined the librarians, no matter what happens to me, at least I'd be able to do some good before the bad finds me. Like it found Beatrice? Bet asked. Of course it found Beatrice. Esther's cheeks were hot again, and it wasn't until she felt a splash on her knee that she realized the heat was from tears, a steady spill of them. She went on, unable to stop herself, unable to hold back the confession. We knew it would find us. People like us, we draw the bad in. There's no good end, not for us. We knew better. We read all the stories, read them too much, probably. We knew that the bad would find us if we didn't... She trailed off because there was no word for the thing Esther knew she should have done. She talked to Beatrice about it 1,000 times, with their legs knocking together as they sat on a porch swing, with their backs in the grass by the creek outside town, or with Beatrice's sweat still stinging her lips. We have to fix it, they'd agreed, over and over again. We have to be better. We can't do this anymore. The last time they'd had that conversation, a week before Beatrice died, Esther had said, I don't feel that way about you anymore. A desperate attempt to rescue them both, saying it felt like dying, although not as much like dying as the fate she'd feared would come for them. It was the worst lie she'd ever told, and it hadn't been enough to save Beatrice. She struggled to find a way to explain all this to Bet, a way to explain how she and Beatrice had brought it all on themselves. It wasn't that we should have known better, she said at last. We did know better. I knew better. But I didn't fix it in time, so Beatrice got hurt. Who knows who else I would have hurt if I hadn't left town? More tears fell into her thighs as she thought of her father, her fiancé, her future children. How many people would she have brought down with her if she'd stayed? There's something inside me that's wrong, she said, but I thought if I joined the librarians, maybe I could wash it out. I could learn how to be better from y'all, and then maybe I wouldn't have to hurt anyone after all. There was a long silence then, punctuated only by Esther's wet sniffs. Her vision was blurred with hot, relentless tears, tears that she hadn't let herself shed at the hanging. Tears for Beatrice, and tears for herself, too, because the thing she had to do felt so huge and so hard. She would have to dig out the broken part of herself, the part that had made her kiss Beatrice that first time, and then every time that came after. She would have to dig it out, and she would have to kill it, and she would have to kill the small secret part of her that had loved the broken thing, that had loved the way it felt to tuck Beatrice's hair behind her ears and lick the hollow of her neck and watch her sleep. Neither of those parts of her could survive if she was going to keep herself from meeting the tragic end that she knew was promised to people like her. I think I understand, Bet said. You wanted to come and join the librarians because we're chaste and morally upright, and we're loyal to the state no matter what, and because we don't give in to deviant urges. You wanted to come and join us because you wanted to learn how to be like us. Do I have that right? Esther nodded, gasping. Yes, she said, please, please teach me how to be like you. She looked up, wiping her eyes, letting herself have the smallest splinter of hope that Bet wouldn't report her for what she'd confessed. That hope dissolved when she saw the grim set of Bet's jaw. Please, she whispered one more time. Fear tart under her tongue because she knew this was it. This was her last worst hope, and this woman who could turn her into the Reaper was looking at her with precisely zero mercy. I know I'm not supposed to be like this. I want to be like you. Bet shook her head, then turned away from Esther, her chest hitching. When she turned back, a small, rueful smile was breaking through the grim line of her mouth. She laughed, a laugh she was obviously trying hard but failing to suppress. She reached a hand out to one side, and for one awful moment, Esther was sure that she was waiting for Lita to hand over her revolver, but then, instead of a gun, Lita put her palm over Bet's, and their fingers laced together. Well, Esther, Bet said, that irrepressible laugh trying hard to shake her voice, her thumb tracing the back of Lita's. Well, I've got good news for you, and I've got bad news. That is the end of Chapter 1 of Upright Women Wanted. It's weird to try and transition with no audience from reading into talking, but I'm going to do my best. So I want to talk a little bit first about the inspiration for the world of Upright Women Wanted. As you just heard, this is a pretty standard Western setting. People are riding horses, they are rationing water, they're reusing supplies as much as they can. They live in a way that we would associate with a lot of Western narratives, especially in film media. But it takes place in the future. As you also heard, the United States is divided into quadrants. It's essentially 4 quadrants, northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast, with a central corridor that's dedicated to military production, training, and service. The way that I put this world together was based entirely on existing dynamics in world history, in fascist and imperialist regimes. What happens in those kinds of governments is that all the focus gets put on the military and colonization, the effort to go to other countries and in some way take them over, form alliances with them that exploit their resources or boost the nation in question's military power and strategy and strategic abilities, or to just completely strip them for resources. We have seen this throughout history in a lot of different places, notably recently in the US's activity in the Middle East. That activity is an act of colonization. It's an act of trying to change another place to make it more like the place that we are in order to get access to resources that we think will benefit us in that area. And as a result, the US puts a ton of money into the military. And that money doesn't come from nowhere, right? It doesn't necessarily come from taxpayers. It doesn't come from increased taxes on taxpayers, I should say. It comes from redistribution of existing budget and finances. For instance, in Germany, toward the end of World War II, all road repair was stopped, both because Germany was getting bombed a lot, and so it's not necessarily practical to keep trying to repair roads that are getting bombed, and because all of that money has to go to supporting military efforts. So the US already has done a lot of this. We've seen the defunding of public education. We've seen the defunding of a lot of social programs. There's a lot of debate and conversation now about whether we should keep on having programs like Social Security and welfare and food stamps and various other kinds of social support systems. And those arguments don't come from nowhere. Those arguments come from a desire to take that money and put it somewhere else. And we call that defense, but really we're not defending ourselves against any invaders. It's just military overall. And most of our military money goes overseas toward going to other places and trying to get those resources that we want. So in Upright Women Wanted, this takes place about 100 years in the future of our country, and just kind of follows exactly what would happen if we followed the path that so many other countries have taken before us, of taking all of our money out of social programming and out of cities and out of states and putting it really focused toward the military. So for instance, people don't use cars in this world because the roads aren't in good enough condition to use cars. Also because cars require resources like gasoline and rubber and oil, oil for both for, car oil and also for lubricants of various kinds that are really necessary to military operations. So during World War II in the US, a lot of you might still be in the habit of saving your bacon grease in like a cooking can. And a lot of people got into that habit and then passed it on to their children and their grandchildren because it was part of an effort that the US was making to conserve all of our resources and put them into the military. So you'd save your bacon grease and then some kid would come around and collect it at the end of the week. And that would go to be used as munitions lubricant. So when we were dropping bombs in World War II, a lot of them toward the end there smelled like bacon. All of those resources get conserved and funneled in one direction, so people don't have them. This is also part of why the librarians are necessary. In this world, the librarians distribute books and media, visual media, and readable media, and songbooks, and some limited amounts of music, all of which are approved by the state. The state here being the overarching government of the country. The reason that they need to do that is because there's not funding on a local level for cities and towns to handle their own education and create their own media. But more importantly, because in a country like this that is prioritizing military expenditures over all else, a huge priority is the destabilization of community structures. And the reason that's necessary is because if a person doesn't have the support of their community, can't rely on their community to support them, then they're going to rely on the overarching government of the entire nation to tell them what to do, what to think, what to feel, what to believe, and how to stay safe. This is a big part of why people think that a government is necessary at all in the first place, is because it's the thing that will keep individuals safe and tell them things they need to know in order to be safe and have access to the things that they need. So in a government that's saying, actually, the most important thing is the military, the only real way to accomplish that is to say, also, your community isn't the thing that supports you. The overall country and the military are the things that support you and that keep you safe, not, your neighbors and your friends. In order to accomplish that, that overarching government has to undermine one of the most fundamental parts of the human experience, which is that we are social creatures. We love to form communities. We love to support each other. That's how we've gotten to where we are today. There's a ton of anthropological evidence that even early Neolithic peoples were supporting each other into old age and in disability. One of the earliest signs of civilization is a fossilized broken femur, because when you break your femur, that's the big long bone in your thigh, you can't walk on your own. You can't go do things on your own. And if you find a healed broken femur from a really long time ago, that's a sign that there was a social support network in place to help someone with a broken femur survive long enough for it to heal. Which means that other people are bringing that individual food and water and helping keep their wound clean and helping them get from place to place if they need to move from place to place, helping build their fire and keep them safe and well. So anyway, that's one of the most natural things that human beings do. That's like our biggest thing. And it's necessary for a government that wants people to put their focus into imperialism to undermine that community support and that sense that the people around you have your back and are the ones who you should rely on, that you should have more local support networks. One of the best ways to do this is through the distribution of propaganda. Propaganda serves a lot of purposes, but ultimately it boils down to shaping the way that people think and feel and how they react to other things in the world. If you go to school and you learn that anyone who wears the color blue is bad and is going to hurt you, and then you go home and you turn on your TV and there's someone wearing blue on the TV who's doing bad things and hurting people, and then you open up a book and the book is all about a bad guy who wears blue who hurts people, you grow up your whole life hearing that, you're likely to think people who wear blue are scary and dangerous. And this is a form of propaganda that's really common. It's educational propaganda, especially, is a huge focus in regimes like the one in Upright Women Wanted. I know I keep on lifting this book up. I just have to show off this cover as much as I can because I think it's so beautiful. Sorry. So that propaganda, very important. As a result, the government in this book and in many existing nations, including our own, has to approve whatever materials are distributed. And that level of control varies from country to country. In really extremist communist regimes and in really extremist fascist authoritarian regimes, that control of what media is consumed and distributed is really fine. It's like extreme. It's every television show, every song, every book, every pamphlet, every, we don't have this right now, but every tweet that you would read would be approved material that reinforces exactly what that government wants you to think. In Upright Women Wanted, one of the big themes that I explore is how that propaganda is used to perpetuate internalized homophobia and queerphobia. Esther, as you hopefully caught from that first chapter, is a queer person and has grown up her entire life reading these approved materials, which in this book includes books, stories, songs, movies. And those approved materials have told her certain things about what it means to be a queer person, what it means to be a young woman who loves other women. I based the message that she received on actual materials that were the only possible, accessible representation of queer people in media in the US during a period where something called the Hays Code was in place. The Hays Code in the US was a moral code for media. It was basically a series of rules about what you could or couldn't show or display or distribute in media. One of those rules was you can't make it look like committing crimes is a good thing to do. One of those rules was you can't show I think one of them was you can't show a police officer being evil. And one of them, which is a pretty big deal to me and to my community, and which is reflected in Upright Women Wanted, was a rule saying that you could not glamorize deviant sexuality. So that encompasses homosexuality, gender identities outside of the binary, even gender nonconforming behavior or appearance. You couldn't glamorize that. So you could show it, but you had to show that anyone who lived a lifestyle like that, like anyone who was gay or bisexual or a lesbian or a man who wears women's clothing because it makes that person feel more like themselves, as opposed to for, a joke. You had to show that that was damaging and harmful. That person had to come to a bad end. And this led to a huge period of time in media history, especially in the US, during which every representation of a queer person was tragic. So you might have a pulp novel. These were really popular. A pulp novel about two women who fall in love and they have a summer of romance. But in order to write that story legally, it was necessary for you to have one of those women saying, I don't think this is right. I think that this is a bad thing that we're doing and it's going to hurt us. And the other one had to be evil and villainous, drawing the virtuous woman off of the correct path. And the only end they could come to was tragic. A very common end to these kinds of stories was that the evil woman, the bad Jezebel who was pushing her lesbian ideals onto this innocent ingenue, would die. And then the innocent ingenue would wind up in an insane asylum, in a mental institution, usually after apologizing and repenting and saying, no, I should never have done it. It's a very common storyline. In film, you'll see, especially in the golden age of Hollywood, you'll see queer-coded characters who, to our contemporary eye are very clearly gay, but they can never say that on film unless something very, very bad happens to that character. And sometimes bad things happen to that character just because he's not embodying the ideal of masculinity that was popular at the time. That's a form of propaganda. It's a form of propaganda that teaches people through immersion that queerness, queer identity, necessarily leads to harm. This is something that Esther grapples with in chapter 1 and throughout the entire rest of the book. Is the idea that the person who she is, who she has always known herself to be, is not only destined for a tragic end herself, but is going to bring tragedy to other people if she's around them. That she's a kind of poison, that her sexuality all by itself can ruin lives, her own and the lives of others, and that that's the only possible outcome. This is something that so many members of my queer community have struggled with their entire lives. That the purpose of this kind of propaganda is, of course, to keep people from expressing their sexuality. It's to reinforce a gender and sexuality structure that is very rigid, that is very, what we in America would think of as conservative, right? That heterosexual relationships are the only relationships you should be in, that men and women have very different roles and that those roles are strictly defined, and that reproduction is the most vital act of a relationship, that the goal should always be to form a family and have healthy children. There's a lot of other pieces in here. There's a lot of pieces of propaganda, say, villainizing disabled people, or saying that they're useless to society, and saying that, sterility or infertility or just plain childlessness by choice is a horrible tragedy, something terrible. But a lot of the focus of my study and research and of this book is on the anti-queer part of that propaganda. All of those things serve the same purpose. You will recall that a minute ago I was talking about how the focus of this society is solely on military support. This is one of the things that makes a society fascist, is when that society's biggest priority is military might. And one of the biggest underpinnings of a fascist society is the idea that might makes right, and that being strong means that you deserve power. And that makes sense then that that kind of a culture would feed a lot of their resources into the military and into going and trying to prove in other places that they're powerful, and that their power means they should have access to resources that other people shouldn't get to have if they're not powerful enough to defend them. If you have a culture like that, you're sending a lot of people into a military system to go and die. A big tentpole of this kind of thing is this idea that's also distributed in propaganda that military glory is the best thing you can hope for, that the most vital thing you can do is go and fight for your country, and if you get injured or die, well, there's valor there, right? So that risk is a good thing that you're taking on. But either way, no matter how glamorous it is, no matter how much you say that it's a good thing, you're still sending a lot of people to go die. And you need bodies to feed into that mill. You need more people to be born so that they can go and fight. A homosexual relationship in a lot of places that don't have access to adoption and artificial insemination and all the different ways that we have to make and give people babies now, and that are very expensive and difficult to access, but available and exist in our current present. If you don't have those things, you don't have access to them, you rely on people making babies with each other, raising them up to think the thing that you want them to think, which is that the country is the most important thing and the military is the best thing you can do, and that you should go in the military and go do what the country wants you to do in the military. Anti-queer propaganda is a vital part of suppressing queer people, forcing them into relationships that they don't want to be in so that they'll make babies to send to the military, to send off to fight. All of that works together. It's a big machine. And it's a big machine that's in this book and that forms all the world building and that has informed the main character, Esther's, ideas of herself and the world for her entire life. She knows what she's learned, and what she's learned has been shaped by what materials she's had access to. This is part of why libraries are so crucial in our current right now environment and the world that we live in. Because libraries, as they function now, today for us, give us access to resources that are not tightly controlled by anyone. If you go to a public school in the United States, the textbooks that you have access to are all very strictly controlled in terms of the material that's in them. They're actually all approved by the same Board of Education in Texas that is a very conservative Board of Education, and that says, here's what our children should know. Here's what we're comfortable with this book saying about our country. This is part of why a lot of conversation is happening right now about bits of U.S. history that a lot of people don't know about. Because if you only know what you've been taught in school, then you only know what's approved by that Texas Board of Education, which aims to reflect the values that it thinks the United States should have. But a public library, you can go to and find resources on all kinds of stuff that isn't approved by anybody. You can go and read books that if you are like me, you could go when you were a little kid and read books that were a little bit too old for you and learn about the world. If you are curious about the history of this country, domestically and overseas, you can go to your local library and say to your librarian, hey, what can I read so that I can learn about these things that I don't know about, that I need to know about? That uncontrolled access to information is one of the things that I think lets Americans fight the way we have been for the last month and a half against this potential future. That access to information and the librarians who give us access to it and who facilitate free and open access to information and data, I think is really vital to preserving the thing that we could potentially be and to preserving a future that we could potentially have. So I know that Jade had a couple of questions for me after that talk. I don't know. I hope I've just been going on and on to myself here. But I would love to talk a little bit to them and then maybe take some audience questions. If that's possible. There you are. Hi.
Hi, so there's a bit of a lag. Sorry, there I am.
There you are.
So we don't have any questions right now. Guys, feel free to ask away. But I wanted to ask about, I have my notes here. When Esther, towards the end, Esther says she wants to save people like her. In this world, does Esther, in the world of Upright Women Wanted, does Esther, will she find a safe place for people like her and Sai and Bet and Lita? Is there a safe place for them?
Yes. This is actually, I mentioned Utah in the first chapter of the book. And in this world, Utah is actually a safe refuge for people who don't want to live their lives the way that the state wants them to. This was a really difficult decision to figure out where to put that safe place, because I think a lot of people, especially a lot of people who I know who are writing today, would kind of reflexively want to make like a big city with a big blue constituency, like, you know, New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco be that safe place. But ultimately, and I think we've seen a lot of this over the course of the last month or so, places with large population density are subject to intense control by the government. I live in Los Angeles, and we were occupied by the National Guard for, I want to say, a week and a half in June. And that kind of resource distribution can't happen if there's not kind of adequate perception of threat on a high level. If they're not saying, oh no, there's too many of these people, we have to keep them under control, it's really difficult to make that happen. Utah, oh sorry, there's a very loud motorcycle going by here. I'm sorry if you all had to hear that. Utah actually has this really interesting history of self-definition and rejecting government control, for better or for worse. And also it happens to be very handily located in a desert, which makes it a little more difficult to get your fist around if you're a big government. There's also a lot of people in that area who are really dedicated to certain civil liberties and who will fight for them tooth and nail. And so I felt that that would be the best place to have a rebel stronghold. So in the world of Upright Women Wanted, Utah is not a controlled territory. The state hates that. They really would love for Utah to just be part of what they're doing, but Utah says no thanks. And so that's a safe place to go if you're looking for somewhere you can live your life as the person you are.
So, Sai, I'd like to hear a bit more about them. Sai is the non-binary character that I've read, and can you explain what that means and a bit more about how Sai came to be?
Absolutely. I have this tendency to write non-binary love interests, which is maybe a little bit narcissistic of me. I'm a non-binary person. For anybody who isn't aware, non-binary people are people who feel that they're neither male nor female. So there's, this idea that you get two genders. You can be male or you can be female, and that's defined by biological sex. And that's not true in nature or in science. There's so much more than I have time to go into right now about how biological sex itself isn't actually divided along a binary like that. There are a lot of people who are biologically something other than what we think of as strictly male or strictly female. And in terms of gender identity and interiority and gender expression, there's such a rich spectrum of different gender identities. A lot of people watching this are probably already familiar with the idea of a transgender identity, which is a person who identifies as a different gender than the one that they were assigned as birth. And there's also, you can be agender, which means you don't particularly feel a connection with any gender identity. You can also be non-binary, which is what I am, where you think of gender as a spectrum with strictly male and strictly female, kind of on opposite poles. And you don't feel particularly connected to either of those. You feel somewhere in between. And that's Sai, who is the love interest in Upright Women Wanted. Sai is non-binary and uses they, them pronouns. If you are feeling confused about how to use they, them pronouns, you use them just like he or she pronouns. You actually already use the grammar of they, them when you use the second person you. So when I say, like, you are going to the store and you will be coming home soon, you just replace the word you with they if you're talking about a non-binary person. They are going to the store and they will be coming home soon. It's super easy. So Sai is non-binary in part because I wanted to explore in this book a thing that a lot of us have to do, a lot of queer people have to do, which is trying to pass as a straight person in order to keep safe. Sai uses they, them pronouns and presents with a gender presentation that isn't strictly female when they are traveling between towns. But when they go into a town, they have to be addressed using she, her pronouns, and they have to wear a skirt, and they have to take down their hair and look feminine. The reason for that is because of safety. It's not safe to be a non-binary person who presents as non-binary and uses they, them pronouns in this world. It's dangerous. If people see that, they'll go, oh, you're not doing the thing that is correct to do. You're doing the bad thing. And so we're going to hurt you because of it. And this is drawn directly from my own life experience. So when I'm traveling, I wear a lot of makeup. I wear a lot of jewelry. Sometimes I'll dress in more feminine clothing to make sure that I don't get hassled or injured by people who think that not adhering very strictly to a binary gender presentation is something that means you should get hurt. And people do that out of a sense of protection of their society. They think that queer people are dangerous and that, we're going to, as Esther thinks in the book, cause harm to people around us just by existing. I can tell you from experience that's not true, but that's how a lot of people feel. And so when I included Sai in this book as a non-binary character, it was really important to me to explore that and the cost of it and how much it hurts to have to change who you are depending on who you're around.
So will there be a sequel or a prequel? Because I want to know more about about how Sai got to meet up with the librarians and even their adventures after the ending of Upright Women. Will you write about them?
I currently don't have any plans for a sequel or a prequel, or writing anything else in this universe. That said, I strongly encourage fan fiction. There are some authors who are like, no, fan fiction is bad. I should be the only one who writes this, and I absolutely do not feel that way. I strongly encourage it, especially for people who see an opportunity in this book to explore their own identity and, you know, find out more about who they are through this story. It's a really great way to do that. The only thing I'll say is if you write fan fiction, don't send it to the author whose work you're writing fan fiction of, because we can get in actual legal trouble for reading it. But I personally don't have plans to return to this world.
Okay. What are you reading now? Or your favorite authors and things like that?
Yeah, I just finished a really wonderful book called The House on Cerulean Sea. The author of whom, it's escaping me right now, but it was so beautiful. It's the story of a world where magical people exist and they are kept away from regular society because they're thought of as dangerous. And the children who are magical are put into orphanages, and one of these orphanages is up for investigation. And the man who goes to investigate it leads a very boring life and lives by the rules, everything he does. And being at that orphanage changes him, and he changes the people around him. It's such a tender, beautiful book. I also highly, highly recommend a nonfiction book called Why Fish Don't Exist, which I recommend reading without learning too much about it, but I will say that it's part memoir of the author and part biography of a famous scientist named William Starr Jordan. And I don't even know how to describe it. The way that it's structured tells you the story of a person's life and the story of who a person is, and says, okay, so now you know that person, you know what you think about them. And then it adds another layer on top of that and says, how does that change everything you just knew? And then it adds another layer on top of that and says, now how does that change everything you think you knew? It's beautiful, it's tender, it's about science and identity and narrative, and it's just totally gorgeous. Other than those two, I will say one of my absolute favorite authors, who I'm really excited about because she has a new book coming out later this year, is Tana French. She wrote the Dublin Murder Squad series, and her most recent book is called The Witch Elm. Her books are really incredibly complex mysteries that are also meditations on class and identity and kind of who a person really is. She does a lot of exploration on whether people are good or bad, and I'll spoil it for you. Usually she decides that they're neither.
I know we have Why Fish Don't Exist. So if you're listening or watching, everyone, we have it on the main floor. And you have a new YA that came out in March.
I
Can
do.
you tell us a little snippet of that?
Oh my gosh, I would love to. Yeah, that book is called When We Were Magic. It is the story of a group of teen girls who are all best friends who have magic powers, and one of them accidentally kills a boy on prom night. And they have to all work together to try and make it right. It's a book about being queer as a teenager and learning to let your friends love and support you even when you're not perfect. It's also a book about consequences, learning to live with them, and how they do and should change a person. It's really strange. Writing young adult fiction is very different from writing for adults, because when you write for adults, I approach that from the perspective of, what's the story that I want to tell? How do I want to be engaging with other existing works of literature? How do I want to be in conversation with my genre? When I'm writing for younger people, like when I wrote this young adult novel, when I wrote comic books for Steven Universe, I approach from the perspective of, what do I wish that I had been able to read when I was that age, when I was the target age of my audience? What do I wish had been in the world for me to find that I could take something away from that would change me? And when I was writing When We Were Magic, the thing I wanted to say most was, it's okay to let your friends be there for you. I think so many of us struggle with this. And this is actually, funnily enough, not to tie everything into my obsession with studying fascist regimes, but the atomization of American culture and of the American individual is a huge part of that. We have this very individualist idea of ourselves that you have to be able to do everything by yourself and stand on your own, and that if you ask for support from other people, you're weak and you're a burden, and you are the thing that's making society bad. And that again runs totally counter to how humans work. We're a mess, right? We're soft. We don't have fur. We don't have claws. We don't have big sharp teeth. We can't jump all that high. We can't run all that fast. The only thing we have is each other. But that individualist idea of what a person should be and how a person should act forces us out of that, right? I adult me right now, having written all these stinking books about how community is important, still struggle to lean on my friends when I'm having a hard time. I still feel guilty when I'm feeling an emotion that's messy and other people have to be around it, or when I need to ask for help. So in this YA book, I just wanted my readers to read it and think, oh, my friends love me. They love me for who I am. Otherwise, they wouldn't be my friends. And that means that they know I'm not perfect. And they know that they can lean on me and I can lean on them, and that's okay.
Wow. You got a few likes out of that. Yeah. I saw that. Does anyone have any questions for Sarah? Questions or comments?
I will answer any at all. It doesn't even have to be about my books. It doesn't even have to be about stuff I know I'll make something of.
I'll give them some time, but while they're writing, I have to reiterate, if you haven't read Upright Women Wanted, we have multiple copies available on the main floor, so don't forget to put a hold on it while they're still here. Okay. Any comments are popping up. How can fans contact you with any questions or comments that they might have?
There's a couple of ways. The best way is to go onto my website, www.sarahgailey.com. I have a contact form there. You can send me an email through. You can also find me on Twitter at Gailey Frey. That's my last name plus Frey at the end. And you can tweet at me there. I also have a Substack, which is like a combination of blog and newsletter. It's at sarahgailey.substack.com. And you can go there and sign up for the free newsletter. And there's also a paid subscription where we just chat every week on Friday. I come in for a few hours and we all hang out. And that's a really great way to get in touch.
Okay. Thank you. Looks like we have a comment from Emax from YouTube who says hi.
Hi.
Okay. And with that, that's our time for this evening. Thank you, Sarah, for meeting with us virtually and talking about your novella and your YA, which we have, everyone. So if you want to check it out, we also have it. So have a wonderful evening.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. This was such a pleasure.
There's
all right.
a flag there.